Good morning, everyone. How are you all doing today? It's a real exciting day to have academic convocation at East Georgia State College. As Dean Cunha told you, this has been a tradition here since 2012. And the reason we have this event is to celebrate the start of a new academic year and to welcome the students, the faculty, and the staff who are new, and to welcome back the returning faculty, staff, and students, and to sit in the same room together and recognize that we're all part of one really big thing, and it's we're on a mission, and we're on a mission to provide an education to all of these amazing students in the room so that you're able to go out and really make this state, this region, this city something that is really special because of the education that you've gotten here. And that's what we're here to celebrate today, the beginning of a new year in working towards that mission together. So at this time, it's my real pleasure to turn the program over to Dr. Sandra Sharman. And I want to take a personal point of privilege to tell you that recently I was able to have the honor of appointing her as our college's Vice President for Academic and Student Affairs. And I say it's a real privilege to appoint her to that position because Dr. Sharman has been part of this special community since 1997. She was the original director of our Statesboro campus, and she became a full professor of reading education in 2015. But what's really important about that is that since she came here, she has really believed in each and every one of these students in this room and their potential. And she's also really believed in the quality of all the faculty and the staff that are in this room. And so she's somebody that's really uniquely qualified to lead our academic and student affairs. She's got a bachelor's degree from Ole Miss. She's got 2 master's degrees from East Tennessee State University and a PhD from the University of Georgia. Let's give a big round of applause to Dr. Sandra Sharman to begin this convocation.
Good morning. Before we get started with the Bobcat Pledge, I will quickly echo the words of Dean Cunha, and that this program, I notice in the program itself, the times aren't listed, but we can expect to go minimum of an hour and 15 minutes. But it's going to be a great convocation program, and I think you're going to enjoy every single minute. Students, please don't worry about your teachers and classes a little bit later. This is an excused absence, okay? Now, Mr. Strickland, I think, is going to have the students stand up. This convocation and induction ceremony celebrates the transition that is taking place in your lives at this very moment. Because of your prior achievements, you have reached a personal and educational milestone. It is now time for you to join students who came before you to this campus in the pursuit of knowledge, discerning judgment, and responsible action. Mr. Strickland. Very well done. You have now earned a place in a community where learning and service are our purposes, and the ideals expressed in the Bobcat Pledge are our guidepost. Welcome to the community of scholars. And at this time, I am going to have Dr. Wedenkamp take the podium.
Hello, I'm Dr. Wedenkamp, Dean of Math Science. I'd like to thank Dr. Sharman for that ceremony just now, and I'd like to also congratulate the students once more for their journey. Let's give them another hand. Today's speaker is Dr. Robert Woods. He earned his PhD in Humanities from Florida State University, and he began his teaching career at Faulkner University nearly 20 years ago. He created and chaired the Great Books Honors College, chaired that for over 15 years. He serves as a lecturer and fellow for the PhD program in Humanities at Faulkner. He's a recognized scholar on the writings of Ray Bradbury, specifically Fahrenheit 451. He previously served as a member of the Board of Advisors of the Center of Ray Bradbury Studies at Indiana University for 5 years. He resides in Fletcher, North Carolina with his wife Tina and their daughter Mary and their 2 cats, Lois and Lowry. Please welcome Dr. Robert M. Woods.
All right. It is a privilege to be here with you today, and I would like to begin by thanking the administration, the faculty, staff, and the students of East Georgia State College. I've had the privilege to be part of higher education for over 20 years, and what this learning community does with this convocation is unique in selecting a book and giving special time and attention to thinking as a community about a book is very unique. It is oddly wonderful in the moment we live in. There are not many other private colleges or universities or state colleges or universities that do anything like this. And it is very impressive. And I commend you, and I'm truly honored to be a part of this event today. So I want to begin with a confession. The old saying, confession is good for the soul. I confessed this to a group of librarians several years ago, and I thought they were going to run me out of the building. The reason I had Fahrenheit 451 on my bookshelf for many years but did not read it was because, and here's the confession, I judged the book by its cover. We should not judge a book by its cover, just as we should not judge a person by their appearance. But I did it, and it was wrong. My act of penance ever since then has been careful study and consideration of this wonderful book, this book that tells us a great deal more about life and living life and enjoying the good life in a weird moment, in an odd moment. It tells us a great deal more about that than the message of what I thought it was all about, censorship. It was on my shelf. I had it on the shelf for many years. And one evening, just on a whim, I pulled it off the shelf and started reading it. And I'm 4, 5, 6 pages into it. And I'm thinking, what am I reading? And I'm 10, 15, 20 pages. And I said, this is marvelous. And as I get halfway through the book, I'm thinking, this is not about censorship. It's about a lot of other things. And after that, I was so fascinated by the mystery. How is it that this book, and let's talk a little bit about, since first being published in 1953, Ray Bradbury's novel, Fahrenheit 451, averages 50,000 copies a year in sales. Some years it's up, some years it's down, but average since 1953, 50,000 copies. It's often read in high schools in 7th and 8th grade. The truth is it should be read in colleges and graduate schools, colleges just as you are reading it. Because there is so much more in this work. So the mystery for me that I had to solve was, how is it that this book that is about so much more than censorship is often understood or described as being a book about censorship and about government, whether the government is from the left or from the right and they're acting in a way against the people. How was it that this work was so described in those terms, but it's about so much more? I remember I came to a conviction pretty early on thinking that it's almost like describing The Wizard of Oz, that novel, and saying that The Wizard of Oz is about a yellow brick road. Now, there's a yellow brick road in The Wizard of Oz, but that's not what the book is about. I'm not sure. I've read The Wizard of Oz, but I'm not sure what it's about. Certainly, it's about going home and how great it is to get home. That's part of it. But it's about other things. And Fahrenheit 451 is exactly the same way. So for me, it was a mystery why this widespread popular misinterpretation of the work. So I started thinking, started digging. And the first thing that dawned on me was something that came out in the novel. And I'm going to try not to have too many spoilers today, but there will be a few spoilers. And I'll try to issue spoiler alerts. But there is a moment in the novel where they talk about when they burn books, and they burn it in the evening because burning books in the evening is a spectacle. I think if you were to try to get a whole bunch of people together to talk about, read, discuss, and think through Fahrenheit 451, and if you were to say it's a book about living a full life, living a life that engages other human beings in community, you're not going to gather a crowd together the way you might if you say it's a book about government censorship. It's about government trying to keep us in a particular frame of mind. It's about the government controlling us. See, that's more of a spectacle, isn't it? You could draw a crowd with that. It's us against the government. If you say maybe it's a book that in part explores how we undermine ourselves and the habits of our everyday life. Maybe it's a book that in part describes what happens when we allow our technological devices to take over our everyday life, to distract us from those who are in our immediate proximity. That's not as spectacular. That's not as dramatic. And yet it should be. So the message of censorship is more of a spectacle, book burning. Also, it doesn't help that if you look at every book cover of Fahrenheit 451 since 1953, every single book cover, in one way, shape, form, or fashion, has a book on fire. So you say it's got to be about book burning equals government censorship. But I want to propose today that it is about book burning, but it's about book burning without kerosene. And it's about book burning in a way that is so subtle and subversive that it sneaks up into our everyday life, and we find out later that our world has been dumbed down by the gadgets that distract us from thinking and being together. So we have the message of censorship as a spectacle, book covers over the years, and then I think there's something to be said about what happens when somebody reads this book and says, well, my 7th grade teacher said it was about censorship. Oh yeah, that's what my 7th grade teacher said too. Well, my 8th grade teacher said it was about censorship. And then so we have a whole nation saying it's about censorship. And then we do that since 1953. So then what happens is you have somebody like me who has the book on the shelf and says, I'm not going to read it because I don't want to read a book about censorship right now. When I want to read a book about censorship, I'll pull Fahrenheit 451 off the shelf. So there seems to be, and then I was fascinated by thinking that this last point goes to one of the main points in the book, mass culture. What happens when there is groupthink, to use another phrase from another author? When we as a whole start thinking a certain way and moving in a certain direction, where the priorities of our everyday life and the habits of our heart are shaped by certain things, and that's a part of the mass culture. And then we miss other subtle truths. We miss other things. So part of what helped me get through this mystery was also discovering that Fahrenheit 451 has a literary history. Now, if you've ever read it before, or if you've read a foreword or an afterword in most editions, especially if it's authored by Ray Bradbury, he talks about writing Fahrenheit 451 in just a few days, putting dimes into a typewriter that he had to rent for a certain, and he typed it in so many. That's true, but that's not the whole truth, because he tells the whole truth in other places. Years before that, in 1947, he had what are essentially scraps. They're snippets and copy and paste of things that he had put together, and it was an abandoned project, but it was a writing called Where Ignorant Armies Clash by Night. You'll hear that phrase again in just a little bit. So what Bradbury did was he wrote this, he tried to write it, but it was essentially about a particular group of people who are acting to destroy works of art and literature to try to keep social order. Later, he wrote a short story called Long After Midnight. And then eventually, Long After Midnight became a short story that morphed into The Fireman. And if you've read Fahrenheit 451, you get the full, mature, developed version of The Fireman. Here's an interesting thing. When he wrote the story of The Fireman in 1951, he received a letter from an author of that time. His name is Richard Matheson. And if you know anything about science fiction fantasy, that's a name that rings a bell. He's old school, but he's one of the great giants of old school science fiction and fantasy. Richard Matheson wrote him a letter and said, I love your story, The Fireman. It is marvelous. Bradbury wrote back, and I actually held the copy of the actual letter that Bradbury wrote back to Matheson, where he writes in there, he says, one day I hope to expand The Fireman into a novel about a fire team that burns books to try to keep social order. And he said, but I'm so glad you caught the whole point of The Fireman. And I'm going to expand it a little bit in Fahrenheit. If I do anything later, which became Fahrenheit, I'm going to expand it. And he said, it's the radio. That radio is going to be our undoing. It is fascinating, because the radio, the only real appearance the kind of radio makes in the novel Fahrenheit 451 is the seashell earpiece, right? But Bradbury also mentions the big screen TVs. There's a scene, it's one of my favorite scenes in the novel, where Mildred wants another big screen TV because she wants all four walls to be covered with these big screen TVs, totally immersive. I forget what restaurant we went into. What was it? It's a wings place. You remember the name of it? Is it called Wings? What's it? Buffalo Wings? If you haven't been to Buffalo Wings lately, next time you go into Buffalo Wings, look at the wall and see if Bradbury wasn't onto something. This particular Buffalo Wings, the whole wall, it was the screen, the TV screen was larger. I think it was 6 TV screens put together, but it was larger than this screen right here. It was almost impossible to eat without keeping one's eye on the screen. So Bradbury's telling Matheson back in 1951, he said, I'm going to write something, if I ever expand it, it's going to be about diversions and distractions and mass culture that takes us away from what really matters. So how else might we know that the work is really not primarily or mainly about government censorship, even though it's mentioned? In an acceptance speech in 1953, and then as late as 2007, Bradbury explicitly said, in words that all of us can understand, he said that for decades, he said it is not about censorship. Fahrenheit 451 is not, he says firmly, a story about government censorship, nor was it a response to Senator Joseph McCarthy. By the way, if you go back and look in history, Bradbury's earlier stories were being written before the McCarthy trial took place. I think it was in 1947, I believe. And so one of the versions, or 2 of the versions, predated the McCarthy trials. So now, was it in part, or is it some way shaped by it? Bradbury admitted unconsciously on some level, probably in some way, but it's not what it's about. He said it was not a response to Senator Joseph McCarthy, whose investigations had already instilled fear and stifled the creativity of thousands. He says the culprit in Fahrenheit 451 is not the state, it's the people. There's the punchline. It's not the government, it's us. We're the culprit. We're the reason that we have the struggles that we're having. There's also internal evidence to the work, and I'll share just a couple things in a moment. And then there's the consensus of scholarly treatment. Dr. Jonathan Eller, who is the head of the Indiana Purdue University, which, by the way, Indiana Purdue University, you know, they're ooey pooey. I have never in my life, what an acronym for it. Ooey pooey. He is the director of the Bradbury Center at ooey pooey. But Dr. Eller and Dr. Tupance both said, and this is from their book, the main target of Fahrenheit 451 is not censorship as is often supposed, but rather mass culture. And then there's an abundance, and this is a key here, and this is what I want to draw our attention to for a few moments today. An abundance of additional thematic readings when censorship is set to the background. Or in other words, think of it this way. I trust all of you at some point in your life have been taken on a guided tour. Maybe in Washington, D.C., or some European city, or an African community where you're given a tour. And the tour guide is saying, I would like to draw everybody's attention to this. Please, everyone, look over to the left. And then we look over to the left. I've always been a bit of a rebel. That's when I always want to look to the right. I just want to see I know I'm missing something over here on the right because I'm being told to look over to the left. So I look to the left, but then I also glance over to the right. Today, please think of our time together as me being a bit of a troublemaker of a guided tour, giving a guided tour in Fahrenheit 451 and saying, let's not look at censorship. Let's not. You can later, and you can explore it later, and you can see the references in the novel to it, but let's not focus on that now. Let's draw our attention to a few other things, and I'll tell you, for the few things we look at, there are many, many more works and ideas within this work. One of the most unique characters in this work, and if there's anything that you as college students can learn, we can learn something from every single character in this novel, just like we can learn something from every human being we encounter. We can even learn something from the people that we completely disagree with. Ideas and values that they hold that are maybe diametrically opposed to our own. We should not act to shut them up. That's people censorship. We should act to listen to them. Still disagree with them if you want to, but listen. And one of the most unique characters that we might be wanting to quickly dismiss in this novel is a young lady, Clarice Mclellan. At one point in the novel, telling Guy Montag, when she meets Guy Montag, the fireman, she says, "I'm 17 and insane," or "I'm 17 and crazy." That's what my uncle says. Tell everybody when they ask how old you are. 17 and crazy. So then they but she really isn't. We find out later she's 16, right? But one of the reasons that she is deemed insane or crazy in the world she lives in is because she offers a critique of education in her moment. Here's what she says about what's wrong with education in her moment. She says, "I don't think it's social to get a bunch of people together and then not let them talk to you. An hour of TV class, an hour of basketball or baseball or running, another hour of transcription history or painting pictures and more sports. But do you know we never ask questions? Or at least most don't. They just run the answers at you, bing, bing, bing. And us sitting there for 4 more hours of film teacher. That's not social to me at all." This young lady wanted an education where she's able to ask questions, where she's able to say, I don't understand. Could you explain that? Or, "I disagree. I don't think that's right at all." But in her classroom of that day, in that dystopian world, it was just thrown at her and she was told, "Accept it, take it all." Clarice has been instructed by her uncle that if asked about her age, she's to respond, "I'm always say 17 and insane." And after a barrage of questions, when she interacts with Guy Montag at the very beginning, she's asking all these questions back and forth, back and forth. And then finally, Guy Montag, who reflects the anti-intellectualism of his age and our own, declares, "You think too many things." In other words, stop thinking. That is book burning without kerosene. Telling somebody, don't think. Book burning without kerosene is saying, don't ask questions. Don't question that figure. Don't question that authority. Don't question that movement. Don't question those people. Don't question that person. Don't do it. That's book burning without kerosene. We find out throughout the novel, the way she's described, she loves to walk and think and talk and observe, converse, enjoy sensations, and essentially live. Clarice should stand as an example of the person striving to fully embrace the sheer goodness of being alive. She is not going to be the one at the end of her life as people are going to say, well, she lived but never lived. Or she was alive for all those years, but she was never really alive for all those years. I remember years ago hearing an existentialist philosopher say he would start his lecture at his class at the university the first day, and he would point to a young man or a young woman in the class. He would say, "How long have you been alive?" And the student would usually respond, 18 years. He said, "I didn't ask you how long your heart's been beating in your chest. I asked how long you've been alive." And they're not the same questions. They're two different questions. How long your heart's been beating in your chest really means nothing compared to the bigger question, how long have you been alive? Clarice Mclellan was alive, and she had been alive for many years. It's not by accident that within the novel, both Mildred, Montag's wife, and Captain Beatty disdain Clarice. They cannot stand her. We also can learn something from a professor, a retired liberal arts professor. In the shorter version, remember before Fahrenheit 451, one of the versions was long after midnight. In the shorter version, earlier, he says this at one point talking to Montag. He says, "I remember that year very well. I came to my class one morning, and there was only one student there who had signed up for ancient Greek drama. You see, that's how it went. Like a block of ice melted on an August afternoon. Nobody passed the law. It happened. And when the people," here is Professor Faber. This is a great line. "When the people had censored themselves into a living idiocy, the government, realizing it was to their advantage that the public read only pap and swill, stepped in and froze the situation." So Professor Faber's observation in Long After Midnight was the government did eventually censor books, and they did eventually burn books, and they used the firemen to burn the books. But long before that happened, the people quit reading. They weren't reading books. They weren't reading. In our moment, we'd say, well, people may not be reading books. I mean, we read text messages, right? We read tweets. We read, are there words in Instagram? I don't do Instagram. I don't get Instagram. But are there words in Instagram? There are, right? Okay, all right. So we read those words. But I think Faber would say, what are you really reading? What's really being written there? What's really being said? Bradbury, I was not ever able to find anything official that he said about Facebook. But I imagine if he knew what it was, he might have said, oh, I didn't say anything about Facebook, but Faber did. Beatty did. Chief Beatty said something about Facebook. They didn't call it that, but they were talking about that. Professor Faber functions as a potential guide from our modern cave. While most of the people in this dystopian world are held captive by the shadows and the daily distractions, Faber sees what is really happening. Like a great professor and a great student, whether it's Faber or whether it's Clarice, they pay attention to what's going on around them, and they don't miss things. And he's, unlike the masses who talk trivial things, the reader sees something totally different in Faber. There's a great line where he says, it's in every version of the pre-Fahrenheit stories and in Fahrenheit. He says, I don't talk things, sir. I talk the meaning of things. I sit here and I know that I'm alive. One of my favorite stories about Ray Bradbury is that when he would travel to other parts of the world, say Paris, there's a famous anecdote that there was a novel that had just come out by somebody he appreciated at that time, and he had the novel in his hand, and he would walk for a little bit. He'd look around Paris. He'd look and take in the sights, might drink a glass of wine, would sit and eat a meal in the public square, and then he would read for a few moments. And then he would get up, and then he would go walking again, looking around and seeing and taking it all in. I think Faber is much like the one who made him, Bradbury. There's another character, and if of all the characters you meet in Fahrenheit, I would encourage you, he's the one that I would say is worth rethinking again and again. And I'm not even sure what I really believe where it ultimately comes from, because in some ways, he is the establishment. He gives the best arguments against reading you will read in this whole book. They are great arguments. He also tells stories about how learned he is, how many books he's read. By the way, if you get a chance to ever see a play version of Fahrenheit 451, let me encourage you to do it. Because there is a moment in the play that Bradbury wrote the play version. It was published in 1987. And in the play version of Fahrenheit 451, there's a moment where Guy Montag goes over to Chief Beatty's house. And he goes over to his house, and he goes in his house, and the thing is, he walks in the door, and the first thing he sees is there are books everywhere. They're everywhere. Montag cannot believe it. And then Beatty reminds him, it's not illegal to own books, it's illegal to read books. You can own them, you just can't read them. And then Beatty says, but anyway, it doesn't matter. In all those books, there's nothing in them. The pages are blank. They're empty. They really weren't. And then he tells a story why he quit reading. And we get this in the play, but we don't get it in the novel. Chief Beatty tells a story about when his wife died of cancer. He said, I went to those books. I pulled them off. I started reading them. I was looking for answers. Why? Why? Why did I lose this one I love so much? And there were no answers. He says that's when he said he realizes the pages were blank. The words that were there, they just ran together and they were blank. He said that's why he quit reading. There are those who think, and I'm in this camp, that Chief Beatty, that if Montag stayed on the path he was on, he would have become Chief Beatty. If Clarice, that troublemaking teenager, had not interrupted him with so many questions, in particular the greatest question of all questions, are you happy? That's the question she asked that he cannot shake. And because he can't shake that, he searches for happiness, and he keeps searching. And he realizes it's not in the distraction, the diversions of his day. Y'all, if you haven't read the novel yet, there's this great moment where Guy talks about being sick. He's sick. He's sick of it all. And she says, why don't you just get in the car and go and drive real fast and run something over? As though that's what you do when you're bored. Or when you don't have anything else to do, or you're sick, or you're unhappy. But Chief Beatty, in one key place, says this: magazines became a nice blend of vanilla tapioca. No wonder books stopped selling, the critic said. But the public, knowing what it wanted, spinning happily, let the comic book survive. And the three-dimensional sex magazines, of course, there you have it, Montag. Here's the line again, folks. From a different person, it didn't come from the government down. There was no dictum, no declaration, no censorship to start with. No. And here it is. Technology, mass exploitation, and minority pressure carried the trick. Thank God. Today, thanks to them, you can stay home all the time. You're allowed to read comics, the good old confessions, or trade journals. There are those who mistakenly think nobody reads in the world of Fahrenheit 451. They do. They read those things. You know those things, those magazines we see when we're walking out of Walmart? You know, we see that Brad Pitt's going to marry an alien woman there this weekend. You know, those kind of articles, those kind of magazines. That's what he's talking about right here. We can keep reading those. That'll work for us. There's another moment where Chief Beatty, by the way, book burning without censorship looks like that. Chief Beatty's description. Book burning without censorship or without kerosene looks like this. Life is immediate. The job counts. Pleasure lies all about after work. Why learn anything save pressing buttons, pulling switches, fitting nuts and bolts? Directly related is the new place that sports holds within this dumbed-down culture. Beatty describes how sports, he says, are wonderful, and this is his words, when you watch them, you don't have to think. All of this is part of the decline in literacy within the world of Fahrenheit 451. Beatty's description of the drop in reading is both a quantitative one, the amount of real reading, and a qualitative one, what people were reading and what they are reading now in Fahrenheit 451. Let's shift just for a little bit and talk about a couple other, some themes. So we have the characters, we have Clarice Mclellan, we have, we could have spent time with Mildred, we could have spent time with Guy Montag, we could have spent time with other characters, the flat characters, the other firefighters, but you'll meet them soon enough. There's a moment where Guy Montag is so frustrated because he's listening to his wife and her friends talking about their lives. And it's so poignant. I'm not going to read any part of that, but I want to encourage you, when you get to that section, slow down and take careful note the way they talk about the things they're talking about. They talk about death and destruction the way we might talk about whether we want this kind of butter or that kind of butter on our bread. So in other words, the things that really matter have become so trivialized and so thinned out, they talk about nothing. So Guy gets frustrated, and there's that moment, and it's portrayed well within the play too, where he opens up a book. And by the way, in the earlier versions of Fahrenheit 451, Montag reads the entire poem of Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold. He reads the entire poem. In Fahrenheit, he only reads an excerpt from it. So when he's done reading, one of the reactions of one of Mildred's friends she says, silly words, silly, awful, hurting words. That's how she describes some of the greatest words in poetry ever written. And one of them even says, it's dumptity, dumptity, dumptity. That's all I heard. That's all I heard from you. She didn't hear a single word. She could not absorb it. But here's book burning without kerosene, and this is from Dover Beach. Really, neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. That's the last line of that poem. Some would say, if you want to describe the moment we live in, the moment Bradbury's describing in Fahrenheit 451, this would be a great description, where ignorant armies clash by night. One of the reasons, personally, I don't do Facebook and other social media is because when I do, this line echoes in my head. And I mean, I hear it in my head when I start reading what people are saying to each other and at each other on social media about anything and everything. And I think, are those the ignorant armies that he was describing in that poem that Guy Montag read in Fahrenheit 451? Are those the ignorant armies that are clashing in darkness, in total darkness? They're at each other, going at each other full force. Lots and lots of noise, but saying nothing, and certainly not hearing each other. The other day I was working with a teacher. I was supervising, encouraging, directing a teacher in student teaching, and he began his session with these children by saying, today we're going to have a discussion. What's a discussion? And one little girl raised her hand and said, it's talking. He said, right. What else is a discussion? And a little boy raised his hand and said, it's talking about things. He said, that's very good too. What else is a discussion? And he was kind of fishing. One thing he was fishing for that none of them got it, sweet little human beings that they are, none of them got it. A good conversation is also about listening, hearing what the other person has to say. One of the great sub-themes in this work is memory, where people can't remember things, and where people talk about not having heard something, or they can't hear what the other person's saying, or they're trying to listen and they can't listen because it's so noisy and so loud. One of the key moments, this is a bit of a spoiler alert if you haven't read it, Guy Montag does leave the city, and there is the archetypal city bad, country good. It's certainly in Fahrenheit. City loud, country quiet. So when Montag is leaving, he goes across a river, kind of a unique river-type moment. Some have even thought it's like similar to kind of a baptism. He's leaving that old life and he's going to this. Some have thought of it as just an exodus moment. But in any case, he moves. But the phrase that's fascinating in that moment is when he goes across the river, it's described as moving from unreality to reality. And here's the line. It says, he floated on his back when the valleys filled and sank. The river was mild and leisurely. His thoughts stopped rushing with his blood. It might be similar to those of us, one of my favorite authors years ago said, to show you how accustomed we are to noise. Take a stopwatch. We would use our cell phones. Set 5 minutes. Set it outside a door. Go into another room or go into a closet. Close the door and see if you can make it all 5 minutes. He says most people can't. We can't endure 5 minutes of silence, 5 minutes of reflection, 5 minutes of quiet, 5 minutes of contemplation. Noise is omnipresent, isn't it? There's another line that says, the river was very real. It held him comfortably and gave him the time at last, the leisure to consider this month, this year, and a lifetime of years. There are a few times in the novel where Guy asked Mildred, how long have we been married? Or when did we meet? She can't remember any of this. I strongly suspect if you ask people, even people who've been married 50, 60 years, Where did you meet? They'll remember. Many can remember that first real conversation with the person becomes their spouse because it was so real to them. She can't. She's been absorbed. Another great question in this work is the question that's asked, what book are you? Here's a real spoiler alert. When the people realize they cannot save civilization by saving books, they memorize them. By the way, I will go ahead and do a little bit of a cheat here. If you've not seen the Book of Eli, this would be a wonderful movie to watch while you're reading Fahrenheit 451. It's marvelous, and Denzel Washington is spectacular in this movie. And it is so powerful, and it is about 50% from Fahrenheit 451. All right, it's clearly borrowed from Fahrenheit 451. But there is this question about what book are you? What are we going to do? So in a society that destroys books and penalizes ownership of books, one option for preserving their content was for people to memorize them. So Fahrenheit 451 ends with direct quotations from Ecclesiastes and Revelation. And as I did research, I was trying to figure out, of all the books that Bradbury could have quoted, of all the moments, there's this other scene when Montag is on essentially a subway. He's trying to memorize something. It's a great moment to show what this book is about, because here he is, he's trying to memorize part of the Bible. It's the last Bible, and it's about to be destroyed. And he's trying to memorize the part in the Bible where Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And Guy Montag keeps saying, behold the lilies of the valley. They neither toil nor spin. And over the intercom is this, Denham's dentifrice. Buy Denham's dentifrice. The idea is it will give you the whitest smile. Your teeth will be as white as a piece of paper. And it's so loud, Montag cannot memorize this part of this book that's about to be destroyed. He's trying. Behold the lilies of the field. They neither toil. Denham's dentifrice. So you have this wonderful juxtaposition of this part of literature saying, don't worry about things like this. And then you have mass culture saying, worry about things like this. Make sure you're giving a lot of attention to your teeth. And then you have him trying to memorize a part of a book that says, don't worry about things like that. Don't focus on those things. Don't think on those things. So toward the end, when he's asked, so which book are you? Guy Montag, I'm paraphrasing here, essentially says Ecclesiastes and maybe a bit of Revelation. And then he says, I'm going to save this reading from Revelation, this memory, what I've memorized from Revelation, when we get to the city. By the way, when you finish Fahrenheit 451 and you think, wish there was just a little bit more, read Ray Bradbury's short story To the Chicago Abyss. Because in Fahrenheit, Chicago is one of the cities that's leveled. Bradbury wrote a short story that talks about Chicago after an apocalypse. And it also is so beautiful and poignant. The central character in that short story is an elderly gentleman that is taken with everything. He loves rappers that rap gum. He sits down and is going to eat a meal. He's not had a real meal in a long time. And he noticed the decoration on the plate. And he's just enamored with the decoration on the plate. Contrast that to a moment like ours and a moment like Fahrenheit where people are distracted and diverted about everything. Toward the end here, there's one of those lines too, and many apocalyptic novels end with the end, right? There's nowhere else to go after the end. I mean, the end. Of all the short stories, I only read one short story by Ray Bradbury that ended with the end. The sun explodes and that's it. It's all over. Whew. That's when you go look for another short story that's going to go in the other direction, right? But in this one, he says this, one of the key characters among the book people says, but that's the wonderful thing about man, about humans. He never gets so discouraged or disgusted that he gives up going at it all over again, because he knows very well it is important and worth doing. Bradbury was asked more than once about his novel Fahrenheit throughout his whole life. It's so negative, it's so much against, it's anti-technology. He says, it's not anti-technology, it's pro-human living is what it is. He said, were you trying to predict the future? Bradbury said, I wasn't trying to predict the future, I was trying to protect the present, not trying to predict what was coming. I wanted to protect the present, the moment we live in. And with this character, he's saying, we're going to get it wrong. We human beings are going to mess it up. But what we seem to be also at is trying to get it right again. And that's the great thing about life. And that's the great thing, too, about life not living to the Chicago abyss when it's already over and you have to start rebuilding. We're not there yet. So we can do something before we get there. One of my favorite little lines in Fahrenheit that communicated to me how I misread it and how others had misread it was this idea that fire is bad because fire destroys. Well, fire does destroy in this novel, but fire also does other things. And then there's this line where Chief Beatty and Montag it's a very powerful antagonistic moment. I encourage you to take note of what happens there. But at one point, Guy Montag says to Chief Beatty, he says, we never burned right. So there is wrong burning and there's right burning. Yes. Wrong burning is attacking and criticizing and destroying each other and books. Right burning is Clarice. She burned right. Faber burned right. He burned out, but he burned right. Guy Montag and the book people, they burned right. Russell Kirk, the American scholar, critic, was a good friend of Ray Bradbury's. And one time commenting on his writings said, with the possible exception of Roy Campbell, the love of life burns brighter in Ray Bradbury than any other man of letters. I would encourage you at some point during this year when you're going through Fahrenheit, also go on YouTube. A little bit of irony there, I know. Go on YouTube and watch some clips of Bradbury interviews. One of the best one is when Bradbury is asked, and he gave the same answer for decades, what's your favorite book? Anybody know what Bradbury's favorite book was? Of all the books he read, and he read thousands, reread hundreds, A Christmas Carol. And he said he loved A Christmas Carol because he said that moment when Ebenezer Scrooge comes out of sleep and he realizes that he is not dead. And the ghost of Christmas future isn't going to get his way with Ebenezer. And he realizes he has another chance. And he declares, I'm alive, I'm alive. And Ebenezer Scrooge changes because he realizes he's alive. And he isn't just meaning his heart's beating in his chest. He's alive. He's going to be different. From that point on, he's going to be Mr. Generosity. From that point on, he's going to take care of the poor in his community. He's going to help little tiny Tim. From that point on, he is going to live. And he lives. And Bradbury says, every time he saw that or read it, he wept. Because it was so good. He is alive. Bradbury was born in August 22nd, 1920 in Waukegan, Illinois. And he passed in Southern California on June 5th, 2012. And this is a marker at his grave. You can see this is what he wanted to be known for. And of all the many stories and novels he wrote and the many things he contributed to, Epcot's Spaceship Earth, he wrote the original script for that. And there are hundreds of other things Bradbury did. Fahrenheit 451. I hope that you all read this book together, enjoy it together, and above all, that you burn right this year. So, thank you. It's been my pleasure. So I understand we have a few minutes for some questions, and I want to encourage you right now, I never turn a question into a mini lecture. So when you ask your question, I will give the best answer that I have, and we'll go on to the next question.
And before you ask a question, I'm going to ask a question. The question is, have you read the book, and are you inspired to? And if your answer is yes, I have copies of the book for you. And if you don't get them today, you can come by my office and get them at some other point. Okay, questions?
This is when I always regret not having planted people in the audience with questions. Always, every time.
So my question is, where do we go now in such a technologically advanced world? Where do we go? What's our next step?
Ugh, I didn't anticipate that one. If we're going to take a cue from Fahrenheit 451, it might be have a similar experience that Guy Montag had, something that calls us to be a people that engage frequently in a life of leisure, and maybe join a book community of people who are committed to reading books, maybe even banned books, but reading books together that offend one group or another, and reading them together and talking through them and thinking through them. I think Bradbury would say that's how we respond to a world like ours.
And also, we are having a banned books reading this month, later this month. You can check at the library. I plan on reading one. I haven't decided which banned book yet. But.
Yeah, regarding the theme you laid out here with the passivity of life, do you have any general other readings you would recommend apart from Bradbury?
He wrote a short story, and I'm not sure I'm going to get the right title, but it is a hilarious. I mean, it is funny, but it's also poignant. And I think it's called Jack in the Box, and it's about a little boy whose mother tries to so shelter him from life. She basically says that you are alive. You're alive here in our apartment in this little tiny world, and if you ever leave this world, you're going to be dead. And so toward the end of the book, when he gets out of the apartment, he's running down the street saying, I'm dead, I'm really dead. And I think what Bradbury does, though, in there, he shows how his mom so often is trying to shelter him and keep him from living and exposure to life. I would say almost any Bradbury short story is going to have the theme of living an active life and enjoying life. Life is good. Bradbury considered life a precious gift that we should all unwrap every single day and enjoy it. I can hear you. Yes. Everything I get from the character of Chief Beatty is that he pretty much bought into the establishment early on. Now, he may have been, before the government did start censoring and start burning books, I mean, it seems like he might have been. I mean, that's a great question. I would have to think through that again, that at least the play version gives sense that he loved his wife, and when she died, that changed everything. So, that's a good question. And who knows?
Could you repeat the questions? They heard the answer. Could you repeat
She was
the
asking,
question?
I think you asked if Beatty lived in any way before his wife died. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. I had a question, or I just wanted to know what you thought about it. Would the main theme be, and I had to write it down, would be nothing can be taken away by government or anyone unless the public has already surrendered it? Do you think that the public has to have a discourse where they say, well, we're finished with it, and then therefore it's taken away by government or other entities? Is that the main theme of the book?
That is certainly a key theme, and you stated it wonderfully. And I think Bradbury would say that the government can't take anything from any of us, but unless we've already given it up. We've already given it over. You know, if we don't know what freedom is, and we live as though we're captivated or enslaved to a wide range of things, how would we know when it was taken from us, right? If we've already been enslaved to it.
So I'm actually monitoring the online chat because we ask questions.
Yes.
And one of the online questions is, how plausible is the future envisioned in this novel?
I don't know how Bradbury would answer it. I think that the vision that the mind that he had and the vision he had of the future, I think most of it's already here. And it's not just the constant distractions with our cell phones and our devices. I think it's things like, there's that moment where Chief Beatty says, one group said they didn't like this book because of this reason, and this group said they didn't like this book because of this reason. And so all these different factions are at each other. They're all warring for different reasons. And he says, and then he uses a phrase, the minority. Basically, we all become a minority. So I am my own minority, and I get to say what I want censored. And I think sadly, in colleges and universities, we're there in some ways. One group shouts, we don't want this. The other group shouts, we don't want that. And what do you know? They're going at it. And that's not what a university should be. University should be a place where ideas, it's a free market and a common expression of all ideas, at least my understanding.
Do you think that we have an advantage living in smaller towns like this in our community?
That's a great question. And
Could you repeat the question?
So the question was, do I think you're at an advantage living in a small town, a smaller community? Yeah. I think in larger towns, cities, communities, anonymity ultimately I think anonymity can lead to suspicion. I'm suspicious of you because I don't know you. Or I'm suspicious of you because I look at you and I think you are what I think you are. But if I know you, if I live in a community with you and we know each other and we know things about each other we may not even be a fan of, but we care about each other, the pledge that you all said, that's beautiful. If you can live that pledge in this community, you're at an advantage to the people on Facebook and Twitter who are always at each other's throats and don't know each other. So,
I got another question. The word communication comes from what I've been studying, comes from the word koinonia, which is to not just talk to each other, but to share with each other. So is Mr. Bradbury, is he saying that there's a dissipation of that sharing, that communication? Is he talking about discourse of not just America, but communities abroad, that there is a misstep in regards to sharing information and sharing what we know, our experiences?
that's a great question. And just looking through the lens of Bradbury's world and all, I think he was thinking specifically of American culture and mass culture and popular culture of that time. And so there's a marvelous essay by the author Mortimer Adler, and he has a book called How to Listen, How to Speak. And there's an essay, a chapter in there called Listening with the Mind's Ear. That would be a chapter I would encourage everybody to read that would help us to be better at listening so that we can really hear each other and communicate with each other. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Suppose there's going to be a remake in movie form of Fahrenheit 451. Who would direct it better and why? The Coen brothers, Steven Spielberg, or Clint Eastwood?
That's a great question. I would say, I almost would lean towards Spielberg because of the movie Minority Report, which is based on a Philip K. Dick short story, which is very Fahrenheit 451-like. So maybe Steven Spielberg, but then the Coen brothers have such a genius and insight into things. And then you said Clint Eastwood. I'm going to go with the Coen brothers. I just think they do. I think they would have that wit that this heavy novel could have. There are moments of witty insight into the human condition and into human life. So now there is a modern version of Fahrenheit 451. I think HBO did it a few years ago. I had a dear friend of mine who knows how much I love this book, who is a film critic. He said, don't watch the movie. He said, there's some great performances, there's some great moments, but don't watch the movie. Because when Clarice and Guy Montag are a love interest, I know you'd be angry. I said, yes, I would be angry. She's 16 years old. So yes, I would be angry. I don't know what his wife thinks. Is Guy Montag married in the remake? Anybody seen the HBO version? Okay, well, I don't even know. Well, okay. All right, I believe that's it. Thank you all so much. You're a marvelous audience, and I hope you have a great year.